Hi, in this video I explain how to calculate equivalent units under the weighted average method. Now, equivalent units of production represent the number of physical units that could have been completed during the period when we consider the amount of material and conversion costs that were used. Think of soda bottles being filled at a manufacturing plant. Not all bottles will be completed at the end of the month. Using the method of equivalent units, we can take these partially completed units and combine them into the number of equivalent units for our calculation purposes. For example, if we have 4 physical units that are 25% complete, those would equate to 1 equivalent unit. There are 2 common methods for calculating equivalent units: FIFO and weighted average. Now in this video, I only cover the weighted average method. I have a separate video where I show how to do the calculations under the FIFO method. Now, the weighted average method is not concerned with our units at the beginning of the period, but instead we look at the end of the period and how much resources were used to date in creating those units. So let's look at our weighted average unit example. Here we have some data on some physical units, and we have a formula that tells us that beginning units in work in process plus units started equals our ending work in process plus units completed. What this formula is basically showing us is that when we consider all of the units that were worked on during the period, those units are either completed or not completed, meaning they're in our ending work in process. So we can take this formula and plug in the amounts given from the table, and then solve the formula to determine that our units ending work in process is 1,100. Now we have the complete information we need on our physical units, so now we can start calculating our equivalent units. So again, we're going to look at our table and fill in the physical unit information that we need. Now, as I said, weighted average method is not concerned with our beginning inventory, so we do not need any of this information when doing our weighted average calculations. What we do need to know is our units completed and our units in ending work in process. So we can add those to our tables. And now we see that our total units to be accounted for is 48,400. Next, we need to look at how much was completed. So notice our degree of completion is different between our direct materials and our conversion costs. For this reason, we have to calculate separate equivalent units for direct materials and for conversion. So let's start with direct materials. When we look at our table, again, we have our units completed. Those units are 100% done because they're complete. So therefore, in our table, we can put 100%. Now, for our units in ending work in process, we need to look at the data that was given. And that data tells us that they are 0% complete with regards to materials. No materials have been added to these units in process so far. We're going to go ahead and put 0 in our table. And now to calculate the equivalent units, we're going to take the physical units times that percent added, and that gives us the equivalent units. And when we multiply that out, we see that our equivalent units for direct materials is 47,300. Now we have to repeat this process for the conversion costs. So again, our degree of completion is different between the two, and so we are doing a separate set of equivalent units for our conversion costs. Again, our units completed are completed, so they're done with regards to conversion costs as well, so we put a 100% in our table. And then we look to our data to determine the status of our units in ending work in process. And here our table tells us that they are 30% complete. And so we're going to put the 30% into our table. Next, we calculate our equivalent units by taking the physical units times the percent added during the period. We multiply it out and we see that our equivalent units for conversion costs are 47,630. Now I want to point out just one more time that because these percentages of completion are different between direct materials and conversion, we end up with 2 different sets of equivalent units for our calculations. Next, we can look at our costs. Here we have our costs to be accounted for. We're going to take our beginning work in process costs plus the cost added this period to get us our total cost to account for. Now we can calculate our cost per equivalent unit. To calculate cost per equivalent unit, we need total cost and the equivalent units. So here we're going to take the total cost, plug it into our table, our equivalent units, which came from step 2, and we divide to determine our cost per equivalent unit. And so here we have our cost per equivalent unit when we use the weighted average method. Now again, I have a separate video where I describe how to calculate equivalent units and unit costs under the FIFO method.